So this is just a study that I pulled off of out of the pulpit commentary, and it is an observation of the conclusion to Mark chapter 16. And in your translations in Mark, there, when you get to the last part of Mark, there will be a bracket beginning like in verse 8 and 9, and then all the way to 16. And there's a discussion on whether or not that should be included in the Gospel of Mark. And oftentimes when you are sharing the gospel with somebody and you bring up Mark 16 verses 15 and 16, right, that you're going to, he who believes and be baptized shall be saved, but he who disbelieves shall be condemned, right? People will argue, well, that's not even in the original text. And I'm like, well, let's just go to Matthew 28, 19 and 20, because it is. But what this does is a really good job of explaining why the translators then, if there is such evidence that it was not part of the original text, why then do the translators continually include it? And if there was overwhelming evidence that it should not be included, then they just leave it out. But when you go back and look at what I have here, it's a very good argument as to why those sections should be included in the Gospel of Mark. So I just printed that up, pulled it out of there, and reorganized it, and then printed it up for you guys. So you'd have a copy of this so you can take a look at and on your own study and get some good insights into why it would be included. I did edit it because there was Latin in here, and there's no need for us to go through and read Latin comments and so forth. So there are some things that are not included in the original that's in the commentary itself. But the way they laid out the argument, I went through and read it, and I thought it was a really good argument, especially when they go through and they begin to lay out the different manuscripts, ancient writings, and so forth that it's included in. So, all right, so tonight we begin with the survey of Mark. We're doing a New Testament survey. We did Matthew. And in noting Matthew, it's interesting as we go through and look at who these books are written to. Keep that in mind because it plays a part into the context of what is being written in each individual epistle. As always, we want to begin with the authorship of, that says the Gospel of Matthew. I didn't change the picture. That should be the Gospel of Mark. I'll get a new picture. It won't matter anyway. The Gospel of Mark, the authorship, we want to start there. So in regards to who is the one who wrote this, the author of Mark, of the book itself, is not identified in the book. That's not a very good sentence right there. He's not in the book. So when you read, like I said before, with some of the epistles, they're opening up with the name of the writer, Peter, Paul, right, so forth. So when you look at the book of Mark, the author is not mentioned or identified in the book as the author. Now Mark is in the book. He's mentioned in the book, but he's not mentioned as the author of the book itself. Haley writes, from the beginning and by unbroken tradition, this gospel has been regarded as the work of John Mark. So when we go through and we look at the unbroken tradition, if we go back to the original first century writers and so forth, there was never a break where anybody concluded that it was written by anyone else, right? So it wasn't as if somebody said, no, wait a minute, we know so-and-so wrote it, and we know, It was continually taught that this was something that was written by Mark. The ancient testimony declares that Mark wrote his gospel as a record of the teaching of Peter. And that's one of the things that you will find consistently in some of these commentaries and history books on these books themselves, that Mark was actually a secretary of sorts for Peter, and that he wrote down what Peter had witnessed. And I'll show you a section in here where in the Gospel of Mark you see a good connection between Peter and Mark, or that Mark mentions Peter enough times that it seems to show a connection between the two. Well, there's another reason why Mark might include Peter as often as he does, and that is because if Peter is by inspiration telling Mark what occurred, he's going to include the situations with his life in there, and he'll mention himself. So that's another possibility of why he's mentioned in there so often. Papias, about the year 130, quoted by Eusebius in Church History 3:39-15, Irenaeus calls Papias a hearer of John, meaning the apostle, and a friend of Polycarp. Papias writes, this too, the presbyter, meaning the apostle John, was saying, Mark, who was an interpreter of Peter, wrote with exactness whatever he remembered, not, however, in order of the things spoken or done, for he neither heard the Lord nor followed along with him, but afterwards, as I said, along with Peter, who made his teachings according to the needs, but not as one making an arrangement of the sayings of the Lord, so that Mark made no mistake in that he wrote some things so as he remembered, for he showed care only for one thing, not to leave out anything of what he heard or to falsify anything therein. So, and look, when you're reading these, you're going to hear statements that seem to remove the idea of the text being God-breathed, right? They're saying, oh, well, Mark sat down to record the thoughts of Peter as accurately as he could remember. It's like, well, if this is by inspiration, it's not that Peter had to go, hold on just a second, let me think about that. Well, I don't think it's on that day. It might have been this day, right? So these people are writing it from a perspective of he is just recounting what Peter said. Well, the reason that's at least brought up anyway is whether or not that's an accurate statement, because if he was writing Peter's account, if that's what he was doing, if Peter was telling him and so Mark was writing it down, if it wasn't just Mark writing by inspiration of God and he was simply being a secretary for Peter, the reason this is brought in is because at the least what we want to do is try to establish who wrote it. That's all this is for. And it's not for us to debate whether or not it's inspiration that's taking place. We wholly believe and support that the scripture is inspired of God. Whatever Mark wrote was inspired of God. Whether Polycarp, Papias, Irenaeus, whatever they said, however they concluded it arrived, makes no difference to us. We're just using these statements as a way to support the fact that they attest this gospel to belong to Mark. So that's why we're bringing this in. Justin, martyr, was born about the year 100. In his dialogue with Trypho, chapter 106, speaks of the memorabilia, and then the Greek word, of Peter, meaning Mark's gospel in which the sons of Zebedee are called Boanagers, Mark 3:17. Here we have the same reference to Peter as furnishing the material for Mark's gospel, and the authority of that gospel is attested. So again, we have another church father who's saying that Peter was writing, that Mark was writing the memories of Peter. But keep this in mind. In one of these things I was reading, the writer said, you know, we could go on and tell you about all these people who attest to the fact that Mark is the one who wrote this. But all those other writers are doing, and these writers are doing, are quoting each other. Right? So you have Eusebius quoting Polycarp or whomever. They're just quoting each other. So you go down the road and you've got 15 places where these individuals say that Mark wrote it and that he was a secretary of sorts of Peter. Well, they're just following what the guy before them said, right? That was the tradition of the time when that original was written. And so when they recorded it, they said, and as so-and-so Eusebius said, or the Polycarp said, or as whoever. So they're going to say the same thing. Because these individuals certainly didn't live during that time period. They weren't there when Mark wrote it, right? So they didn't see Mark sitting down with Peter, and Peter saying, hey, let me tell you what happened. And then Mark writing it down.
And also, there's some people who think that Mark was a relative or son of Peter's.
Yeah, well, calm down. Ken's getting out of control, people. No, yeah, we'll get it done in just a second. Not a real son,
Yeah,
but a disciple.
a disciple, some makes the argument that
Because it refers to him as that.
he might have been,
Yeah.
might have been a real son too, so.
Well, hold on, and we'll get to some things like that. Yeah, there's a connection there. And that's one of the reasons people will say, well, Peter could have been saying this to Mark, because Mark was around Peter a lot. And, certainly we know that Mark was around Barnabas. We know that Mark was around Paul. But there was a break between the two, and Mark went off with Barnabas, right? But eventually he's working and traveling with Peter, and it seems if Peter is the one who converted Mark, possibly, and I'll give you some examples of where the interconnection is. So with all those things taking place, then it would be easy for people to conclude, well, then Mark was just a secretary of Peter, and so he wrote these things down as Peter was giving record of them. But if in fact that was the case, it would have been the gospel of Peter, not the gospel of Mark, according to Mark. Because all Mark was doing then was just taking Peter's words and writing it down and saying, here's what Peter said. But by inspiration, if we hold to inspiration, then that these are God-breathed words, and Mark is the author of this text, then God used Mark to do this. Now, there's nothing wrong with God using Mark to do this and getting information from Peter. In fact, who's another writer that we know in the New Testament that did that? That he went and gathered his information. Luke. Luke gathered his information, and that doesn't remove inspiration from what he did. He wrote an account that all happened. He talked to these people, traveled with these people, right? So it doesn't take away from inspiration just because that might be the case. Clement of Alexandria, toward the end of the 2nd century, in Eusebius, church history, reports that the hearers of Peter were so impressed by the oral discourse they heard from him that they earnestly begged the companion of Peter to put their contents in writing for them so they could always recall them. So here's another tradition. They were saying, well, they heard this, and they told the companion of Peter, could you write this stuff down for us? Now, let's say that's true. Let's say that's exactly what happened. It still doesn't change the fact that if that's what God wanted done by inspiration, Mark wrote down what he wrote down. It doesn't change that. You don't have to look at it and say, so wait a minute, what you're telling me is that these people wanted Mark, the companion of Peter, to write these things down. So Peter sat there and told Mark his story while he wrote it down. Where's the inspiration? Well, as I said before, it would be no different than what Luke did. And there's inspiration there. So just because someone is writing down something from somebody else, in fact, if you take a look at this, and that they actually requested this of Peter to get Mark to write it down, the same thing happens with Luke. Who was Luke writing for? Theophilus. So Theophilus had set out to get an account of this, and he was using Luke to do it. That doesn't take away from inspiration. It's just God using those opportunities for him to reveal whatever it is that he wanted revealed. So, all evidence, church tradition, and it's unbroken, as Haley said, it's unbroken, always points back to Mark actually being the writer of this gospel. All right, let's look at Mark's background now. John, surnamed Mark, so we see him referenced as John Mark. Acts chapter 12 and verse 25. Take a look over there. Acts chapter 12 and verse 25. I'm just going to show some verses here that will bring in who he actually is. In Acts chapter 12 and down in verse 25, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. Okay? So, John, who was also called Mark, was the son of a woman named Mary, we'll show that in just a second, whose home was in Jerusalem, whose home in Jerusalem was a meeting place for the disciples of Jesus. Go back to verse 12. It said, we can, if you want to go back to verse 11, Peter was in prison, right? And he gets released. So when Peter came to himself, he said, now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the Jewish people, all that the Jewish people were expecting. And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. A couple of things to note here. It states, Luke states here, that Peter went to the house of Mary, which the phraseology means that this was her home, she owned it. So she was probably a woman of some means. Since it's referring to her and not her husband, she's probably been widowed, right? And the fact that the church is meeting in her home may indicate that she had some prominence within the Christian community there, herself being a Christian. But that is, Mary is the mother of Mark, or John Mark. All right? He was a cousin of Barnabas. Go to Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. Cousin, there's also some indication it's a different, I can't remember what it was. It said cousin and some other, but cousin is a commonly accepted relationship. Says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greeting, and also Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you received instruction. If he comes to you, welcome him. So he is the cousin of Mark. He may have been a Levite. Let's go over to Acts chapter 4. So he may have had a priestly lineage. And again, this is not for certain, but there's some indication. Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. Now Joseph, a Levite of Cyprian birth, who was also called Barnabas, who is Mark's cousin. And if Barnabas is a Levite, right, then it's very possible then that Mark was also a Levite. So it says, who is also called Barnabas by the apostle, which translated means sons of encouragement. So it's possible that the lineage of Mark is a Levite. We know that he's related to Barnabas. It had been thought, and this is actually a curious statement, and we're not sure, but again, this is something to consider because we're never given the information about this. It had been thought that he was a young man who fled naked on the night of Jesus' arrest in Mark 14, verses 51 and 52. Now, going to Mark, when you're reading this, if Mark is the author of it, or Mark being the author of this, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to mention himself in all those situations. If in fact this is him, then he could have just simply listed it as if he was an observer of the account of the young man going away, because we're never given the young man's name. Mark 14, 51 and 52. And a young man was following him. And actually it's been said that Mark, when he started this whole journey of his, was probably in his 20s. So he's a young man. So a young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped. All right. One of the interesting facts about this, and certainly inspiration would provide this. Somebody had mentioned something the other day, I think Ken did. He said, how would this is an example of inspiration in Matthew, revealing Herod's wife's statement about the dream, right? The only way Matthew was going to know that Herod's wife had that, or that, Pilate's wife had that dream, was by inspiration. It wasn't like Pilate came out and said, oh, wait a minute, my wife had a dream and she told me not to do anything with this righteous man. So certainly that has to be by inspiration, and he knew that. So there are accounts that you find within the gospel that are going to be revealed in that these individuals were not eyewitnesses to it, right? And so it was relayed to them. The account of Peter's denial of Jesus and what transpires that night certainly could just be simply a revelation to Mark about what happened that night. But there's enough information as you go through Mark that seems to put him, at least in some degree, contact with the apostles at this time. He may not have been following them and been part of their group, but he may have been watching from a distance. That's why some say this could have been Mark. I'm not saying it is, but this could have been Mark. And when he records it, he could have recorded an event early on in his life of what happened as he witnessed this, and didn't include his name in it. Which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's neither here nor there. It's just that's in there, and many have concluded this is probably him, or it could be him. Mark's mother may have been an influential person in Jerusalem. It was to her home that Peter went after the angel released from prison. We see that again. Around AD 44, Mark went with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch, Acts 12:25, and started with them on their first missionary journey. But he soon left them and went back, Acts 13:13. So he leaves, I believe it goes down to Bithynia. So he leaves. But he is with them at one point in time. So if he's with, let me back up here. If he's with Paul and Barnabas, Barnabas is his cousin, so he's going to have the influence to get him involved in this work. Later, around AD 50, Mark wanted to go with Paul on his second missionary journey, but Paul refused to take him. This caused the separation of Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 15, 36 through 39. Mark then went with Barnabas to Cyprus. So you still see him in there, but there's not a lot about him, right? You see these little moments where something happens, and then, he goes off, but we're not being told the work that he's doing in any of this stuff. Even when he's with Paul and Barnabas, there's not all this stuff included about what he's doing. So, some 12 years after that, about AD 62, Mark appears in Rome with Paul in Colossians 4:10, Philemon 24. I got to fix that. And 4 or 5 years after that, Paul is asking for Mark to come to him in 2 Timothy 4:11. We already looked at that. Thus, it seems that Mark, in his later years, became one of Paul's close co-workers. So there was a time that he worked with him, he separated from him, he went back with him, and he was still having some connection with him. But there's also a connection between Mark and Peter. Mark may have been a convert of Peter, and let's take a look at this. This is the one that Ken had brought up. 1 Peter chapter 5. It's how he refers to him. First Peter chapter 5 and verse 13. So Peter says, "She who is Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark." Now, if Mark is his legitimate son, then you have to make the connection between Mary and Barnabas. And there's no connection in the text between Mary and Barnabas and Peter. Peter went to Mary's house, but it doesn't say that Mary was the sister or the wife or something. It just says that it went to her house. It never makes a connection that Peter and Barnabas are related in some fashion or form. But nevertheless, there is the way the wording is, and oftentimes this phraseology is used for converts. Paul refers to Timothy as his son. So this seems to be that Mark was a convert of Peter. And early Christian tradition says that Mark was, for the most part of his career, a companion of Peter. He did spend some time with Paul, we saw that, and there was some work he did with him, but for the majority of his career, of his working for the Lord, he seemed to be working with Peter. He was with Peter in Babylon, possibly Rome. Rome has been referred to as such, Babylon. When Peter wrote his first epistle, again, we see that in 1 Peter 5 and verse 13. The outline and content of Peter's sermon, and so here's some connections. The outline and content of Peter's sermon in Acts chapter 10 and verses 34 through 43 is very similar to Mark's gospel. So if you want to go back and read that account in Acts chapter 10, 33 through 43, and then having read the gospel account of Mark, you'll see a very similar layout of what they're talking about. So that's one of the connections that they have made with Peter and Mark over the years. The gospel, with the exception of John the Baptist, begins with the call of Peter, right? So it goes from John, Mark begins with John calling, and then jumps to Peter, who's brought up right away. Peter's name appears in 136, 11:21, 13:3, but not in the other gospels accounts of these same things. So in those same situations in other gospels, Peter's not mentioned in them, but Mark actually mentions Peter's name in those accounts. All right, so there is some kind of a connection there. We know from what tradition has said, Peter did travel or Mark did travel with Peter. We know that Peter mentions him as his son, a companion, and so there's some indication then that he had a connection between not only Paul, but also with Peter in the work that they were doing. All right, what's the date? Nothing certain is known, but probably before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Why is that the case? Well, in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, we have the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming of Christ, right? In Mark chapter 13, we have something similar. It's written differently, but it's something similar. And in Mark 13, 1 through 23, we have the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Jesus is telling them, not one stone will be left upon another. And he's talking about the city, the temple, everything. So Mark is writing this account stating what Jesus said, and he does not say anywhere that has come to pass. And remember, oftentimes you would see that with, like, for example, Luke. He would write something, or in the other Gospels, at the end of the Gospels, and they remembered what Jesus had said, right? They would think back, and they remember what Jesus had said. When we read of these writings, and they mention, for example, Matthew and Mark, the destruction of Jerusalem, and they never conclude after mentioning that this had transpired under the reign of, or had taken, then it just leaves open the idea that this hadn't happened yet.
I've heard it said too, that Mark was the first gospel because it's truncated. It's short little snippets rather than expanded out. Matthew and so on. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, because you were talking about that, and I did some research on that. So here's one of the issues with Mark being considered the first gospel that was written. And there's a couple of different theories on this. One, that idea is tied very closely to Q, right? So the idea that the Q document existed and that Mark copied from it and then everybody copied from him. So the idea that Mark came out, at least in one theory, was written first is based upon the theory of the synoptic problem. And there's not a synoptic problem. The problem is people came up with a synoptic problem. So there's not a problem with that. Secondly, it's believed, and I read two different accounts on this, that all these Gospels could have been written pretty close to the same time with one another, right? And no one was borrowing from anybody. It wasn't that Matthew had to go borrow something from Mark. And that's not saying that going out and getting information from somebody else was wrong. We know that certainly Luke did that. But by inspiration, they were writing their account. Linsky states that Matthew was written first. He believes Matthew was written first, and then Mark followed up. Now, if you're looking at purpose of the writing, we haven't got to that yet with Mark, but if you look at the purpose of the writing, it would seem to me that Matthew being written first would be a better choice, because Mark is written to the Gentiles. Matthew is written to the Jews. And who do you need to impact first and foremost? Who was impacted first and foremost throughout the book of Acts? It was the Jews. The Jews, the Jews, the Jews. So the inroads into the Gentiles doesn't happen until we get to Acts chapter 10, Cornelius' household. That's when we begin to see that big push, right? So in looking at the order of it, it could very easily be argued that Matthew would have been written first because it was to the primary audience of the time. Mark would have followed up because it was written, and here's the other thing, not just to Gentiles, even more specific, Romans. And we're going to look at some stuff of why it would have been Romans. It's really interesting when you begin to see how the writer addresses what he addresses, because you're right. Mark writes in pericopes. He doesn't go into a lot of discourse about what Jesus said. Matthew did. Remember, Matthew did a lot of what Jesus said. Mark does a lot of what Jesus did, not so much what he said. And when you think about the audience, that's something that appeals to the Romans. The Romans were not all about philosophy. That was the Greeks, those were the Jews, theology. The Romans weren't so much into theology and philosophy. They were all about action, going and doing conquest, getting something done. So when Mark writes his gospel, he writes it with Jesus doing things, accomplishing things. And that would be something that is more appealing to them. So you have a Roman audience being addressed here, or, Gentiles, but certainly the Roman audience. So that being the case, you can see the argument for one or the other, I look at them as all being inspired of God, and that if there was a particular order necessary for that, you could just well argue that the Gospel of John would have been a great one to put first because it deals with the deity of Jesus. If you're trying to get these Jews to snap out of their, we're going to hang to the law and keep denying Jesus, that would have been a great gospel for them to have gotten first. Listen to this one. The Gospel account by John, Jesus is who he claimed to be. But in going back and looking at what Matthew does, Matthew deals very heavily with Jesus' discourse dealing with the Jewish people, dealing with their laws and stuff. Mark doesn't. And so it tends to be more something that was written for a Gentile people. So either way, and again, when I was looking at that, I thought, well, where's the basis for the Gospel of Mark, his account being first? And I'd have to say I believe it's tied directly to Q. It's like, well, he did the Q's in existence, and he copied from them, and then the others. But when we go back and we look at dates, since we don't have dates certain, and both Matthew and Mark both include very similar thoughts in regards to the destruction of Jerusalem, the second coming of Jesus, they're both being written around the same time period. And again, as one writer said, they could have all been written, simultaneously. Matthew, Mark, and Luke could have been written, all together. By different writers, of course, but within the relatively short time period. All right. So again, we don't have a specific date, but we would say prior to AD 70, just simply because Jerusalem has not been destroyed, and Mark talks about it. In the tradition reported by Irenaeus, if the tradition reported by Irenaeus can be relied on, that it was written at Rome after the departure of Peter and Paul, which then again, if it was written at Rome, and Mark was in Rome with Peter writing this, then a Roman audience would be something that would play into this as well. And if by the word departure, he said after the departure of Peter and Paul, we are to understand their death, we may date it somewhere between the years 64 and 68. But, in all likelihood, this is too late. It is probably near the truth to date it 8 or 10 years earlier, so somewhere between 55 and 70 AD. And when we go back and we look at Matthew's dated a little bit earlier than this, but, and some go back to 45 with Matthew, but no later than 70 AD as well, because of the destruction of Jerusalem. So they're within that relative time frame. All right, so at this time, here's the rulers. Nero would have been ruling at 54 to 68. Galba, Otho, Metilius, Titus, Flavius, Vespasian, these were all have been ruling during the time period of that when it was written. So you can pick which one would have been in there. More than likely, Nero, right? Nero Claudius. Caesar Drusus Germanicus. What a name. And then as far as the Jewish ruler, Herod Agrippa. And when we go back and look at Peter being thrown into prison, as Mark records, Herod was in charge at that time. So, all right, what's the theme of Mark? I read different themes, but this is the one that I've always gravitated to. And it's very similar to Mark, the first verse out. Now, the first verse out isn't always the theme of something, right? It can be in the first chapter, whatever. But the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, that says a lot. So Mark, writing to a Roman audience, is making a very straightforward statement. This is the gospel, the beginning of the gospel, when it started, of Jesus Christ, and he's the Son of God. Linsky then lays out 3 arguments as how this is proven. 1, Jesus proves himself to be the Christ, God's Son, by his mighty teachings and deeds, 1:14 through 8:26. Jesus proves himself to be the Christ, God's Son, by teaching and enduring the passion, which is followed by the resurrection, 8:27 to 16:20. And remember, Romans chapter 1, Paul says he proved himself to be the Son of God through the resurrection. And then Jesus proves himself to be the Christ, God's Son, by teaching and enduring the passion. Oh, actually, there was another one in there. I just repeated that one. There's actually supposed to be another one. So, no, this is it. It's just 2. I know what I did. In the third one I have here, he actually went through this long outline, and I just took the outline out. I didn't think you guys want to see the whole outline of how he does it. So 2 points. He proves himself to be the Christ, God's Son, by his mighty teaching and deeds in 1:14 through 8:26, and then 8:27 to 16:20, he does it through the enduring of the cross. So there's other, people have seen other themes in there. Pick up your cross and follow after me daily, or Jesus is the suffering servant. That's also another one that I saw people talk about.
You talked about, this ties that with Romans, and it does make a mention in here that he went in the wilderness and he included the wild beasts. Now, Rome was supposedly started by people who were suckling on a female wolf, so that might have been
Main indication of,
be included in there.
yeah. So in going back and looking at the theme, and again, the one that kept popping up was this idea that, he was a suffering servant of God. But I think you can still include that under this statement right here, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay? This is the good news of Jesus. And actually, one of the key words in the Gospel of Mark is son. But it's used in several different ways. One is he's the Son of God, and 2, he is the Son of Man. And John also uses those same statements. So when you go back and look at the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Jesus is his incarnation. Christ is his Savior. The Son of God is his deity, right? So he's man, he's Savior, the Christ, the Messiah, and he is deity. And then how is that proven? And if you're looking at Rome and their way of thinking, this would be more along the lines of how they would think. One of the things, and I don't, we're not going to do it tonight, but we'll get to it next time. One of the things that Mark doesn't include right off the bat, and this gives you an indication that he's not writing to Jews. Mark jumps right to John. He says a little bit about Jesus, and he jumps right to John, right? Go take a look over Mark chapter 1. And this is something, it's what he doesn't include that gives us some indication of what Jesus is doing. So he says, the beginning of the gospel, Mark 1:1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it was written by the Isaiah prophet, behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight. John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for forgiveness of sins. Right? He goes through 9 through 13, Jesus is baptized. 14, now after he'd been taken into custody, Jesus came into Galilee, preaching the gospel of God, all the way through. You know what he doesn't include at the opening of his epistle, or of his gospel that Matthew did? No genealogy. Completely leaves it out. Because he's not addressing whom? The Jews. He's not addressing them. Yeah, the Jews would want to hear all about the genealogy. That's what he's talking to. So he's not going to address that. He's going to go to something else and move on from there. And we'll get into more of that next time. So beginning next week, we're going to take a look at the audience and the purpose of Mark. The audience and the purpose of Mark.